Imagine this. You're a decorated U.S. Army general, returning home after months of serving your country abroad. The night is tranquil, the streets are familiar, and every fiber of your being longs for the warmth of family. The mission had been long, grueling even, but fulfilling in a way that only service to others can be. Your thoughts are consumed with visions of your daughter's school play, your son's basketball game, and the joyful chaos of home. The freeway is quiet, the glow of traffic lights paints the road ahead, and you feel, for the first time in weeks, truly at peace. And then, red and blue lights flash in the rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. Is it a broken taillight? A routine check. You pull over, confident you've done nothing wrong. As the officer approaches, you roll down your window, maintaining the calm and respect drilled into you over decades of service. Evening, officer, you greet, handing over your license without hesitation. But something shifts. The officer's gaze sharpens, suspicion flickering across his face as he takes in your appearance, your dark skin, your uniform. His voice hardens, his demeanor changes, and suddenly, this is no routine stop. Questions grow pointed, demands escalate, and before you know it, the order comes. Step out of the vehicle. You comply, every movement deliberate and measured. But the tension is thick, charged with something far deeper than a traffic violation. You feel it in the officer's gaze, in his tone, in the way he calls for backup before you've even had a chance to explain. Soon, more police cars arrive, lights flashing as a small crowd gathers, their phones raised to capture the unfolding scene. Despite your calm cooperation, you're cuffed, aggressively, humiliatingly, as if you're a dangerous criminal. The metal bites into your wrists, and the night's peace shatters into chaos. The murmurs of the crowd turn to shouts of protest, their voices rising against the glaring injustice. But none of it stops the officers from hauling you into the back of a police cruiser, your dignity left behind on the asphalt. Inside the station, the cold, sterile light accentuates the starkness of your reality. Fingerprints are taken, belongings confiscated, and you're led to a holding cell. You sit on the hard bench, the weight of the moment pressing down. How did it come to this? How could everything spiral so quickly from peace to this nightmare? Hours stretch into eternity. Meanwhile, outside, the world is waking up to what has happened. Footage of your arrest spreads like wildfire across social media. The video, raw and unfiltered, lays bare the injustice of the night. The calm compliance met with unwarranted aggression. Outrage pours in, voices uniting against the systemic bias that led to this moment. Protests erupt across the country, people demanding answers, accountability, justice. When you're finally released, there's no apology, no acknowledgement of the wrong done. You step outside into a storm of flashing cameras and reporters clamoring for a statement. But what can you say? How do you put into words the betrayal of being treated like a criminal in the country you've dedicated your life to serving? At home, your wife embraces you tightly, her whispered words of relief cutting through the chaos in your mind. For a moment, you find solace in the quiet of your home, in the innocence of your sleeping children. But you know the peace is fleeting. The world outside is demanding answers, and your face has become the rallying cry for a movement that can no longer be ignored. Kitchen seemed to shrink around him, as the voice on the other end echoed in his ears. Officer Paul Jackson, the man whose actions had upended his life, whose choices had ignited a national movement, was now reaching out to him directly. For a moment Michael couldn't speak. What could Jackson possibly want? An apology? Redemption? Or was this another attempt to justify the unjustifiable? Why are you calling me? Michael's tone was measured, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear what Jackson had to say, but something inside him, a sense of duty or perhaps simple curiosity, compelled him to listen. Jackson hesitated, the silence on the line stretching thin. I owe you an apology, he said finally, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. I've watched that footage more times than I can count. I see now what I didn't see that night. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Was this genuine? Or was it some calculated move to salvage Jackson's tarnished reputation? He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table as he considered his next words. Do you think an apology is enough? Michael asked, his voice calm but cutting. Do you think saying I'm sorry erases the trauma, the fear, the damage you caused? Not just to me, but to my family and everyone who saw what happened that night. I don't, Jackson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't expect you to forgive me. I can't ignore this anymore. What I did, what this system allowed me to do, it's wrong. And I need to do something about it. Michael closed his eyes, the weight of Jackson's words pressing down on him. Could this man, this officer who had caused him so much pain, truly be seeking to make amends? And even if he was, what did that mean in the grander scheme of things? Could one person's change of heart make a dent in a system so deeply flawed? Change starts with actions, not words, Michael said finally, his voice steady. If you're serious about making this right, you need to be prepared to fight for justice. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been wronged by this system. I am, Jackson said, and for the first time, there was a spark of conviction in his voice. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm ready to take responsibility. I want to testify, to speak out about what happened, about what I've seen. If it helps fix even one piece of this broken system, it's worth it. Michael let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He wasn't sure if he believed Jackson yet, but the possibility of his former adversary becoming an ally was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark situation. Then start with the truth, Michael said. Not just to me, but to the world. Own your actions and commit to being part of the solution. I will, Jackson promised. Thank you, General Anderson, for listening, even when I don't deserve it. As the call ended, Michael sat in silence, his thoughts racing. He had never imagined this moment. An olive branch extended by the very man who had wronged him. It didn't erase the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could help shape a better future. Upstairs, the sound of his children's laughter floated down, a poignant reminder of what he was fighting for. Justice, accountability, change. For them, for their future, and for every family who had suffered as his had. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. The name hit like a sledgehammer to Michael's chest, dragging him back to that harrowing night. A flood of memories crashed over him. Humiliation, anger, fear. All raw and vivid, as if no time had passed. For a moment, the phone line was eerily silent, a vacuum charged with unspoken tension. Then Jackson's voice broke through, hesitant but steady. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to. His words faltered, lingering in the charged air, thick with unspoken regret. Michael said nothing, his thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and confusion. He couldn't quite grasp what he was hearing. I know I can't undo what I did, Jackson continued, his voice heavy with shame. I acted out of bias. I let my own prejudices dictate my actions, and you didn't deserve any of it. I'm sorry for what I put you through. Michael's chest tightened as the words sank in. How many times had he played out this moment in his mind? Imagined what he would say to the man who turned his life upside down. Yet here it was, an apology, and he was speechless. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jackson added quickly, as though sensing Michael's silence. But I needed to say it. To take responsibility for what I've done. The line went quiet again. Michael could hear the sincerity in Jackson's voice, the weight of genuine remorse. But forgiveness? That was a different matter entirely. I appreciate the apology, Michael finally said, his tone measured but firm. But this isn't just about you and me. It's about a system that enables these things to keep happening. Jackson's reply was barely audible. I know. And I'm trying to figure out how to be part of the solution. Michael exhaled deeply, the gravity of the conversation pressing down on him. He hadn't expected this call, let alone this admission. While the apology was a start, it couldn't erase the past or fix a broken system. I hope you mean that, Michael said, his voice steady yet resolute. Because this is bigger than us. In the weeks that followed, pressure mounted on the police department. Investigations into Jackson's actions were thorough, and the announcement finally came. Officer Paul Jackson was terminated from the force. The decision sent shockwaves through the community. For some, it was a triumph of justice, for others an overreaction. For Michael, it was simply a step. A beginning, not an end. The protests persisted, their anger morphing into a broader call for reform. The movement swelled, demanding change not just from individuals, but across entire systems. Michael, once a victim in the shadows, found himself at the forefront, speaking at rallies, meeting lawmakers, and channeling his voice into a rallying cry for justice. One evening, he stood before a massive crowd in Atlanta. The sea of faces staring back at him represented every background, every race, united for the same cause. The sight filled him with cautious hope. "This fight isn't about one man or one officer," he declared, his voice carrying strength and conviction. "It's about a system that's failed too many for far too long. And we won't stop until justice isn't just a word. It's a reality." Cheers erupted, reverberating like a battle cry. Michael felt a swell of emotion, the weight of their collective hope momentarily lifting the burden he bore. But not everyone in that moment shared the crowd's energy. Alone in his small apartment, Jackson watched the protests unfold on television. Guilt gnawed at him as he saw Michael speak with passion and purpose. He'd thought about attending a rally, blending into the crowd to listen, to learn. But shame held him back. Instead, he began reaching out to organizations dedicated to police reform, attending workshops and listening, truly listening, to the stories of those hurt by systemic injustice. Slowly, he started piecing together the depth of the problem, confronting the biases he'd long ignored. Months passed. While the protests lost some of their intensity, the conversation never faded. Talks of racial justice and policing reforms became ingrained in national discourse. And at the center was Michael, a reluctant leader, yet a powerful one. One evening, as Michael sat on his porch, the distant hum of the city mingled with the laughter of his children playing in the yard. Sarah, his wife, sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. Michael sighed, his gaze distant. "Tired," he admitted. "Like the weight of this thing just keeps getting heavier." "You've done so much," Sarah said, her voice filled with pride and concern. "No one would blame you if you stepped back." "I can't," Michael replied, shaking his head. "Not yet. There's still so much left to do. Even with the progress, policies against racial profiling, new training for officers, it wasn't enough. The wounds were too deep, the changes too incremental. Justice was a long road, and Michael was committed to seeing it through. But amidst the larger fight, a more personal struggle lingered. The scars of that night, the humiliation, the raw vulnerability. One afternoon his phone rang. The voice on the other end spoke hesitantly. "Michael, Officer Jackson has requested to meet with you." Privately, Michael's heart skipped a beat. Could he face the man who had wronged him so profoundly? Days of contemplation followed, supported by Sarah's quiet wisdom. "If you meet with him, it doesn't mean you're forgiving him," she said. "But maybe it'll help you find peace." 2 weeks later, Michael sat in a modest community center conference room. The door opened, and Jackson entered, smaller, humbled, and without the authority of his badge. "I don't know how to begin," Jackson said, his voice trembling. "But I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth." And for the first time, they truly talked. Not as adversaries, but as two men facing the weight of a broken system.